Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this Engaging the Mind program. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm so pleased that you are joining us this afternoon. Before starting the program, I want to bring a few things to your attention. We received many questions in advance of the program that have been shared with the speakers. If you have a question during the presentation, you may enter it in the webinar Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You will find resources in the webinar chat box below. Please also note this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's Vodcast library in about a week or two. Now on to our speakers. Grace Elizabeth Hale is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia. An award-winning historian and internationally recognized expert on modern American culture and the regional culture of the U.S. South, she has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the American Scholar, and has appeared as an expert on Southern history on CNN, C-SPAN, and PBS. She's the author of the book we are here to discuss today, In the Pines, A Lynching, a Lie, a Reckoning, and 3 other books, including Making Whiteness, The Culture of Segregation in the South, from 1890 to 1940. Our other speaker is Claudrena Harold. She is the Edward Stettinius Professor of History and a Professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. She is the author of many books, including The Rise and Fall of the Garvey Movement in the Urban South from 1918 to 1942, and The Punitive Turn, New Approaches to Race and Incarceration. In 2019, Harold and UVA's Lewis Nelson co-edited the volume Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Inequity. Her latest book is entitled When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip-Hop Eras. So as you can see, we have 2 very distinguished scholars with us this afternoon. Thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. Professor Hale will speak first and then welcome Professor Harold into the conversation after her initial remarks. So with that, Professor Hale, I invite you to start the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Just going to share this screen. Have a few just pictures to show you, but I'm just going to speak really briefly about how I came to write this book before turning it over to my colleague and friend, Claudrena Harold, and then we'll have a conversation about it and weave in some of your questions. Thank you for coming today. So this is an intimate family story. It's also a true crime tale and it's a history of a little-known, flourishing Black community. And like most histories, it starts with a story. The first time I heard this story, I was in college and my grandfather was dead, but my mom told me this tale that was really straight out of To Kill a Mockingbird. She was about 10, and the way that she remembered it, her father, my grandfather, Ori Berry, was the sheriff at the time, and he had stayed up all night at the jail to protect a prisoner that he was holding there from a white mob. This man was a Black man who had been accused of raping a white woman. And he said that he would, have to shoot people if they tried to take this man out of his jail, but they were not going to do that. And in her telling, he was a hero. So that really shaped my life growing up, this story, and really in many ways shaped my path into grad school, and the fact that one of the first things that I began to research as a grad student was the history of lynching in the South. And when I was in grad school, I think Claudrena will probably laugh at this, but, grad students kind of can be full of themselves. I thought, oh, I've got all these great research skills. I know what I'm doing. I went to visit my grandmother. I'm like, I'm going to dig into this story in the local newspaper, office there in the town. And there I did find a front page story that recounted this incident. I learned the date, August 1st, 1947. I learned the name of the man who had been accused, Versie Johnson. But it was a very different story than the one that my mom had told me. And it really made me think. By that point, I'd read Ida B. Wells. I'd read the NAACP's reports on lynching. I understood the ways that white Southerners lied about this practice. And I saw one of those lies right there on the front page of the newspaper. And that there were many things that troubled me about the story, but the main thing was that this man, Versi Johnson, had asked the sheriff, my grandfather, to take him out of the relative safety of the jail and to the alleged scene of the crime in a place that really could only be thought of as prime lynching territory. Mississippi has the dubious honor of being the state with the most lynchings in America. And so I quickly realized that the story wasn't true, and it made me realize that the story that my mom had told me wasn't true either. But when I tried to ask my family members about it, no one wanted to talk about it. And to be honest with you, all of you that are here today, I really didn't have the courage to dig any further. I didn't want to upset my family. And so I became a historian and taught Southern history while running away from my own family's past. And it wasn't until 2017 happened in Charlottesville that I finally got the courage to dig into this story. And the reason that incident, I don't have to tell most of the people that are listening today what happened in Charlottesville, I would assume. If you have a connection to UVA, you know. But what I kept thinking about sort of in my despair afterward was that all of these lies that perpetuate white supremacy are not impacted by the kind of serious work that historians do. And that made me think about the fact that there was this lie in my own family and that it hadn't been impacted by the work that I did. And so that's what made me think, okay, I've got to dig into this story. I've got to try to find out what really happened. And to make the point that history is not abstract, it's always about people, and it is always somebody's family story. And so that's when I began to research this book, and I was really lucky enough to win a Carnegie Fellowship, which gave me the kind of support that I needed to spend a lot of time in Mississippi, in the courthouse and the Chancellery Clerk's office, and talking to people, doing the research. Now, this book has three main characters. The first is my grandfather, seen here. And that person with those garish pants on is, in fact, me at age 5. My grandfather was sheriff 3 times in this county, and this was the final time in the early 70s when he was sheriff there. But he is, of course, one of the main characters, the man in the front of this crowd of people. They're pouring alcohol into a drainage ditch there, and you can see in the background a brick building, and that is the jail where Versi Johnson would have been kept. That's also during my grandfather's first term as sheriff. The other main character is, of course, here's one more of my grandfather and my grandmother posing in front of a log truck. I think it's the day they got married. It's a strange choice for a wedding shot, but that was the main thing going on there then, was logging. The other main character in this book is Versi Johnson himself. And so one of my major goals as a scholar and historian was to resurrect as much as I could, to find out as much as I could about his life. I never did find a picture, so I'm using this document as a picture, because on the back of this World War II draft registration form, we do get a description of Versi Johnson. And that's the closest thing I have to a picture. But I was able to trace his family back for 3 generations to ancestors that were enslaved in Lawrence County, Mississippi, which is not too far west of where this incident later happened in Jefferson Davis County. This also is his birth certificate, which is another one of those incredibly important documents in my search for Versi Johnson's story. Again, sort of substituting here for a photograph. And then the final character in this book is the place. Most people aren't familiar with the piney woods of Mississippi. If you aren't from Mississippi, you probably have in your mind the Mississippi Delta. That's the part of the state that sort of is most known to outsiders. This is a very different kind of place. Rolling hills covered by longleaf pine forests for much of its history. But I think it's important to my story that this this forest is being cut down in the time period that both Versi Johnson and my grandfather are growing up and headed towards their fateful meeting. And then the other aspect of the place that I think is really important to the story I'm telling here is the Black community, because it is not just Versi Johnson that is attacked in this incident. It is this entire community. And one of the things that I think most people don't know about Mississippi is that despite it being the state with the reputation for the worst racial violence in the country and the oppression of Jim Crow, there was quite a bit of Black flourishing here, and particularly in counties like Jeff Davis County, which really got that name as a kind of mean sort of trolling joke on the part of the governor that named it, because this county was always Black majority from its founding in 1906. And it was a place where many, many Black people moved after emancipation because they were able to buy land there and also homestead land there, so work the land and get it for free. And there was a flourishing community of Black landowners here that founded many, many churches, as Black people have done all across the South, but also in a more unusual move, they founded their own Black educational institution, the Prentice Institute, which is modeled after Tuskegee Institute and really provides sort of every kind of educational need for this community. And many of these Black landowners end up owning as much as 1,000 acres. And so as the story unfolds, I'm trying to show readers that this community is also being attacked in this act of violence. So if you want to know what really happened, I'm going to leave that for you reading the book. The book is written as a kind of narrative that unfolds, as a story that unfolds. But that's probably enough for me to say. And I'm just going to invite my colleague, Claudrena Hale, to come onto the screen and into conversation with me, and to really thank her for giving up some of her time today to do this.
No problem, no problem. First of all, congratulations on the publication of your highly anticipated book, In the Pines, which I think is a testament to your singularity as both a historian and a writer. And across really 8 captivating chapters, I think you provide us with a portrait of your family's complex history against the larger backdrop of political and social developments in the nation. And I think in doing so, you really push the reader to grapple with what you so eloquently refer to as the cumulative power of the past. With vivid detail, you recount the multiple narratives surrounding your grandfather's role in the lynching of Versi Johnson. And you also speak to multiple audiences. And I was wondering, why is that so important to speak to multiple audiences? And in my view, the multiple audiences that you are speaking to is your family, white Americans, and African Americans. And is that a correct read?
It absolutely. It's a hard question, but it's a fair question, and it's a good one. And I'll start with the latter maybe and work my way backward to my family. I spent a lot of time talking to Black people in Jeff Davis County working on this project. And as is, shouldn't be surprising, many people were very wary to speak to me. And it took multiple trips and multiple conversations, and sort of people vetting you versus putting you in a matrix of other people you might know. And it took a lot of that kind of work to get people to talk, but eventually people really did talk. And this community has just such an incredibly rich and interesting history that I very much wanted that history to be in this book. I think that people don't understand that one of the things, one major reason for white supremacist acts of violence is Black success, right? And so Versi Johnson, in a sense, is not successful in his individual self. He He is not one of these Black landowners. He is not one of these Black folks in Jeff Davis County who gets a college degree at the Prentice Institute. But he symbolizes that for white people. And I felt like without telling that story, I couldn't be, I wanted to tell that story because it was entrusted to me by so many people. And I wanted to tell that story because I don't think you can understand the impact of these kinds of acts of violence without knowing that it impacts a family. For sure, Russi Johnson's family is obviously devastated by this, but it impacts the whole community. And I wanted that to be there. It's not a coincidence that not long after this killing, they start the very first NAACP chapter in Jeff Davis County and begin a more organized resistance. Not that there hasn't been resistance, but a more organized resistance to Jim Crow white supremacy. So I wanted to speak to that. So I think that would be what I would say for the Black audience. I also very much tried to find Russi Johnson's family, but did not succeed. So if they're out there, I still would like to talk to them and meet them. But the second part is this part that is aimed at white Americans. And, you know, it's a sort of hard divide to make, because on the one hand, some people feel like there's too much stress on violence against African Americans, and other people really want to erase that violence and not tell that history. And so it's a very complicated time in America to try to speak, I think, to that problem. But given the kinds of attempts at censorship of history and the sort of holding up of nationalistic romantic visions of America's past, it seems to me that we still have a lot of work to do in uncovering and telling the true story of these kinds of incidents. So I was trying to tell that story, that part of it, the excesses of white supremacy, why it's wrong to have a conception of citizenship as the hands of the law, as whatever white men do is the law. The law is not an abstraction, but it's this power that we have, and we can use it however we want. I thought it was really important to unpack that and describe how it develops over time and impacts this small place where you can really see it playing out for white audiences. That might be a story that more Black audiences might already know, but it still seemed important to tell it for those white audiences that don't know it. And then for my family, this is a really tough question, but my family has mostly lionized my grandfather. He is seen as a patriarch, a very successful person who really pulled himself up from a very impoverished background to be, you know, a successful man and really a well-respected in terms of the white community of Jeff Davis County citizen. I mean, he was elected sheriff 3 times. You couldn't succeed yourself then as sheriff. And his white neighbors thought enough about him to re-elect him multiple times. So it was important for me to say to my family, and really this is for other people in the audience as well, you know, you can love people and they can have done really bad things. And those aren't, those contradictions are real, right? And many Americans live with that. They may have a family member who's incarcerated. They may have a family member, you know, it's something a lot of American families live with, but it's also something that other families like my own deny. And I just really felt like it was important to say, you know, you may have your memories of him, and I'm not telling you they're wrong, but it is also important to know that he did these things, and he shaped the world around him in negative ways, and he could have made other choices, and we need to face that.
Yeah. When you said that you can love your family, I think of you're such a beautiful writer. And I think of a sentence where you're talking about the beauty of Mississippi, but you're also talking about the love that you have for your grandparents. You say, I loved everything about these Mississippi visits with Pa and Monk, as we called my mom's parents. The time I spent with them had a profound influence on the adult I would become. And one of the amazing things about the book is that you're able to capture the beauty. History is a discipline, but writing is an art. And you capture that beauty without sentimentality. And that's extremely important, because I think if there was too much sentimentality and you read the book thinking that there's this effort to save someone, it would be a harder book to read. And how do you balance the facts and the telling of this deep story with also a commitment to form and beauty? And here I'm thinking of Richard Wright, who, after reading reviews from Uncle Tom's Children, he wrote, "If I ever wrote another book, no one would ever weep over it. That it would be so hard and deep that they would have to face it without the consolation of tears." And I felt that when I was reading this book. And I think it speaks to not just your deep knowledge of facts, but in some ways a mastery of form. And so could you talk about the writing process, the clean sentences, the pace, the tone in writing the book so that you could achieve your scholarly objectives as well?
I will talk about it as much as I can, but I do think in the end, sometimes there's just something that happens when you're trying to do something creative that can't be entirely explained, or not by me at any rate. But I tried to start with just a very concreteness. I think many Americans don't understand rural America. And I don't mean by rural America like free union. I don't mean that places around Charlottesville that are thriving, they're rural, but they're full of, wealthy people and beautiful homes. And I mean rural America that's not doing so well, that is the sort of most rural America, not just in the South, but particularly here in the Deep South. And I just didn't think most of my readers would be familiar with those places. And I really wanted to make that place concrete. And so I really tried to be very descriptive, because I wanted to really take people into that space. Because I think one of our biggest problems as a nation is that many of us don't understand rural America, and we've kind of just turned our backs on it. So that was also bizarre. That was something I also just really wanted to do, just take people into a place that really is not flourishing and hasn't been flourishing really since the 1950s. Economically, it's been in decline. So concreteness, just really writing down notes when I was there about what I saw, what was around me, what the landscape was, using that kind of concrete specific detail about the plants and the terrain, and, to just make people come into the story. It's not something I had done before as a historian, but I really felt like people wouldn't understand what was happening if they weren't in the place. And the fact that the forests were all cut down, that both Versi Johnson and my grandfather essentially grew up in these ruins, these forests that were just decimated, clear cut, just ruins, like a war zone. That just seemed to me to be important, as a sort of foundation, as something that kind of sets this tone for the book. So I tried to do it with that kind of concreteness, and also to let people have their own emotions, not to try to say, you should feel this way. I think of that as the Steven Spielberg approach. Like, he always has to just rub your face in it. And I just wanted to trust the reader to go there, because that's where our humanity is. If you aren't going to feel something, if you're not going to go there, then I really can't make you. So I don't know if that makes sense, but not to be overly dramatic in the language, or overly emotional in the language, to leave the space for the story to take you there, if you want to go along with it. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it makes a lot of sense. And going to the story, and going to, in some ways, the scene of the crime, and the lynching of Versi Johnson, and also the unfolding, the story about rape. And there is a suggestion in the book that this was a rape. Then there's also the argument that this was a rape. Then there's also the argument that this was a relationship. And as you were reading the book, as I was reading chapter 7, then I had these questions about the white woman at the center of this, but also at the margins of this. And could you say a little bit about the white woman in this narrative who is unnamed, but unnamed for a reason? And could you talk a little bit about how you came to know about the multiple narratives around this white woman, but also your decision to tell the story the way you told the story?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is that I spent a huge amount of time trying to find out more about the white woman who is unnamed in all of the articles, as was standard practice at the time. And sorry about the dog barking, folks out there. So I tried to find her. She was renting with a husband, renting a house. And that made it complicated to find her. It was not in a census year, so that made it complicated. You know, if this had happened in 1950 or 1940, it would have been easier to locate her. Long story short, many hours of research into it, I was not able to find out who she was. None of the Black people that I talked to remembered who she was, remembered her name. And none of the white people that I talked to wanted to talk about it at all. So I did not discover who she was. That left me with the standard tales that get told in this time period. It is the case that white people always call any relationship between a white woman and a Black man a rape. They always make those kinds of allegations in this time period. And it is common for Black communities to respond to that by saying it was a consensual relationship and we knew about it and they were in a consensual relationship. And oftentimes that was true. Oftentimes they were in a relationship. But I simply could find no other information to back up exactly what was going on there or what happened. I don't have reason to doubt the Black community memory, but I will say that it's important to recognize all of the reasons why the Black community would say that, because this is, of course, the excuse that is always given for lynching, that it has to be done to protect the quote unquote purity of white women, and the Black community has a kind of collective response to that always. And it makes sense why they do. Right? That makes total sense. So I was disappointed not to get to the bottom of that. But one of the things I kind of liked about not knowing more about her was we didn't get deflected onto her, because these stories of the white woman either being violently attacked or being in a consensual relationship put too much emphasis on the white woman. You know, it brings any story about these acts of violence back to a white woman when the story really needs to be about the Black man that's often at the center of the crime, which is not the crime of rape, but is the crime of an extrajudicial or vigilante or some sort of breaking of the law killing. So that, I couldn't find out more about her, but in the end, I felt like, okay, this means that my narrative won't be deflected onto that story, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I think another thing I appreciate about the book is that it doesn't end in 1947. And it continues into the civil rights era. And it also continues with your grandfather being elected and reelected as sheriff twice. And I think that part of the story is so important, that he was able to continue, that the costs were different. And I deeply appreciate that you continue to tell that story, the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, because I think that is also a part of the story of racial terror that we need to know as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, not only did he not pay a cost, but I think he's reelected because he is seen as somebody who can be trusted to do what white men want him to do, what white people want him to do. The sheriff before him actually stops a lynching of Black men accused of killing a white man who had been a law officer in Jeff Davis County, but wasn't at the time, but a prominent white citizen. And the sheriff before my grandfather as sheriff stops that lynching. And so it was important for me to tell that story and hold it up as a contrast. He is not reelected ever. He's not sheriff ever again. My grandfather is sheriff 3 times, including being appointed in 1970 when a sheriff has to leave the office. He then wins in a special election, to be fair, but he is appointed, which is another sign that he is held in high esteem. And when he's not sheriff, in between those times, he's a fire marshal. So he's again working for the government, in that case, the state government. And he's also investigating crimes, including church burnings during the civil rights era. So there is no cost for him.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit about, I think we all are part of a family, and we all have family history. And could you say a little bit to someone who may think, well, I have an interesting story about my family that I need to tell, that, this is part of the racial reckoning. But could you also talk a little bit about what makes this story and the story of your grandfather unique, and a story that many, it's a book that many people need to read? Because I think the natural reflex or response may be, well, I have this story in my family, but could you talk about the singularity, but also the universal nature of this story? Why is it so important?
Well, I think I'll start with the universality. I mean, there are so many stories like this in white families. I mean, I think my family story is perhaps at the extreme end, but there are many people who have family members who've committed acts of racial violence. Many people have family members that were in the Klan. Many people have family members that, benefited from redlining or participated in other kinds of financial misdeeds, people that are stealing land from Black families through tax sales, et cetera. I mean, there is a lot of this kind of story to go around. And again, mine might be at the extreme end of that range, but I think that's part of the universality that white folks need to realize, that white supremacy is not something that just got done out there in the world, but that if you have white relatives, you probably have some of these people in your family. So I think that's important. As to the specificity of this story, I think that what makes it particularly interesting is that the re-elections and the being reappointed as the fire marshal. And that is why I don't stop the story in 47. There are plenty of sheriffs that participate in these sorts of things. And there's a lot of evidence, in fact, that law enforcement involvement in extra legal killing is increasing in the 1940s and 50s. In very much in relation to lynching decreasing. So white people aren't going to do it publicly. They're not going to celebrate it, but they're going to continue illegally to kill Black people, and they're going to lie about it. And law enforcement is often involved. But I think my grandfather's story this particular story, and Versie Johnson's story is singular in the fact that my grandfather continues to have that kind of success and positions of power, and the fact that there is such a strong Black community in this place that is fighting back, and that their story is very much entwined in his story, if that makes sense. And that story is so much a part of what's going on here. That is what white people are upset about. In the aftermath of World War II, they have sort of woken up and realized that all around them are Black landowners that are very successful. And those folks some of them are going to the Prentice Institute on the GI Bill. Hundreds of them are using their benefits to go get more education. People are using their benefits to get loans to buy more land. The Black community there is really thriving thriving. And it's almost as if white people hadn't really noticed it because it's a separate community. It's very much a Booker T. Washington, build your own community, your own businesses, and people are thriving, and white people just really aren't paying attention. And it is that aftermath of World War II moment where they really sort of take notice, it seems to me, and realize just how much they are surrounded by a successful class of Black landowners who have managed to get their own agricultural extension agent, for example, based at the college, who are accessing federal agricultural programs despite discrimination, who are really more educated than they are. Right. And so I think the uniqueness of this place really also is why this particular singular story is important.
A lot of research just went into this book, and I wonder if you could talk about the research, and in doing so, I want to just draw attention to two questions in the comments. One is, doing the research and trying to trace Versy's background, trying to reconstruct that Black community, which you've talked about a little bit, but also doing the research and dealing with the evidence of your grandfather's involvement in this lynching, and how you approach, first of all, how you defined lynching, and maybe some folks in the audience would like to know how you are defining lynching if they haven't had the chance to read the book, but how you dealt with what some people may call circumstantial evidence.
Yeah. Well, the research was extremely hard. I've never written a book like this as a historian, and I've done a lot of research and I know how to do research, but this is one of the reasons I think that we don't know enough about rural America, is that the research is really, really hard. The sources are scarce. There aren't archives collecting. If there are archives, like the Prentice Institute clearly had archives at some point, almost all of that has been lost. So it's really hard research to do. And I really found success in two ways. One, the Latter-day Saints digitization of genealogical records is a godsend to all scholars and everyone trying to do their own research. And genealogists are absolutely brilliant. And I don't know why I didn't know that all these years as a historian, but I consulted with, I did tons of research, genealogical research, and then consulted with a couple of experts in Black family genealogies just to check my work and make sure that I hadn't made mistakes or to maybe turn over leads that I hadn't found. And I have so much respect for those scholars. They know so much about how to use the documents that are there. And that was really, really crucial to this research. But the other thing that was really crucial was local records. So you can't research this, just staying home. You have to go and be in the Chancery Clerk's office. You have to go to the circuit court office. You have to go in the storage rooms. The books are moldy. There's no archivist. As a young scholar, I remember going to the archives at places like Virginia and Princeton and being like, wow, this is the opposite of that. You're in the county's record storage, and it's not there for you. It's there so people can trace property ownership or trace, the history of the county government. But those records really proved essential to my research, because what I found is that the white people would lie about what they did, but they wouldn't lie about the money. They kept really accurate records about how the county spent its money and how the city spent its money. And that's where I found the details that backed up the stories that I got from the Black community. It was finding, somebody would tell me one thing, and then I go look in the minutes for this Board of Supervisors meetings, and I can find a reference to that same thing. So I found that was really, I didn't know that going in, but they did not lie about the money, but they would lie about what they did in the paper, right? So that was another way in which just being there in the county records was so extremely helpful.
Yeah, this is in some ways I think in some ways a personal question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because we've had some questions that deal with the relationship with your family. And we both know there is the researching the book, there's the writing of the book, and then there's the publishing of the book. And could you talk a little bit about how those different stages have shaped, transformed just your relationship with the extended family? As much as you care to share.
Yeah, I think nobody in my family wanted me to write this book is really the easiest way to say it. People had not all the same reasons that they didn't want me to write the book. But none of them wanted me to write it. My mom, first and foremost, did not want me to write it. She lionizes her father, and she didn't know what happened at the time. She was a child. She wasn't told. She wasn't present. And she really doesn't want to think about anything being different than the story that she has grown up with. And that's understandable to me. She is not going to get there. She is not, she seems to have decided that she can still love me despite the bad thing that I have done. I guess that is one of the messages of the book, after all. In her mind, the bad thing that I have done, which is to somehow sully the memory of her father. But it's a tough thing. I mean, I don't think, if you're not going to be able to have those hard conversations and accept the fact that a lot of people are going to be really upset with you and may not get over it, then certainly don't investigate your family story. It certainly isn't something people wanted me to do. And even younger members of my family, and I'm not going to identify anybody by name, but that I really thought would be very, very supportive and behind me for a whole different set of reasons than my mom and the older generation, they didn't want it told either. And so that was really shocking to me, sort of across political perspectives and ideologies and different sort of positions in society. They didn't agree on anything else, but they all agreed that this wasn't a story that they wanted told. And I think, maybe had I known the extent of that when I started, who knows, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But I really felt like I could convince them, as I went along, that I could, the truth would convince them. But here we are. So
Could you talk a little bit about this current moment in history? I mean, reckoning is in the title. And could you talk about just the politics of historical reckoning now?
Yeah, it is absolutely dumbfounding to me as a historian that's been, doing this job for 25 years, that we are having this absolute out and out battle about history in this moment. When I started out as a historian, you really, most people would just yawn if you just told them you were a historian. So it's interesting how much it has become such a flashpoint, and it's an extremely difficult time to teach history and to be a historian, because all of these different folks have such diametrically opposed ideas about what we need the past to do, and what the true story of the past is, and what information should be out there circulating. And they're not all equal. I'm not both sidesing it here. I think some people have valid reasons for their beliefs, and others just want to whitewash the past and deny that bad things ever happened. But all of it combines to make it extremely difficult to actually talk about real history in public in our world. I don't know, Claudrena, you teach history too. Jump in here and help me out. But it is just a really difficult time. People don't want complexity. They don't want contradictory, ambiguity, all the things that are part of human life. And it's just hard.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is hard in this moment. And also, I think it's hard to just to give you a perspective of an African American when I was getting ready to read this, and to sort of think through, in the language of one commenter said, racial trauma. So how do we also confront the violent past? How do we engage that? How do we provide a narrative and African Americans are not presented as just perpetual victims?
Yeah.
That is always a struggle. And we want to focus on agency, but at the same time, there are these things that happen that shape us now. You know, the effect of the cumulative effect of the past is something that I think we have to grapple with. But I think we grapple with it through deep research and also skilled writing. There was a way in which, when I read about this African American community and the Black institution building and the efforts in the educational and political arena, I saw that complexity. But if that was not there, this would have been a tougher book to read.
Yeah. Well, I really felt like that had to be there because that is what white people were targeting.
Mhm.
I mean, it has the additional effect of being a story about Black life and not just about a Black victim of violence. And that is important as well, right? But
Yeah,
to me,
yeah.
we can't understand this history. I mean, I sometimes had to argue with my editor, who was actually fabulous, really incredibly great at helping me not to do what historians do, which is bog down in the details and keep the pace going. It was really a fabulous editor, but he would say, I don't understand why this is part of the story. And I'm like, I don't know how else to explain it to you, but it is part of the story. It has to be part of the story. And he did by the end understand that. Absolutely, he understood that. But I feel like we have a sense, we don't understand history accurately. So people, his reaction would be, you're downplaying the badness of Jim Crow, telling us how well these people are succeeding. You know, that's making it seem like you're minimizing the violence. I'm like, well, given the theme of the book, I don't think I'm minimizing the violence, but those things are both true. And I guess that's an example of what I feel like is one of those complexities that people just have a hard time hearing, that Jim Crow is awful, and yet some people really succeed in building this separate Black flourishing world, and we need to know that.
Yeah, I think when you brought up the issue of Charlottesville 2017, and that's a battle that we had when we were editing that book, is that I don't think you can understand that moment or even the notion by former alums that something had been lost if you did not understand the rise in Black enrollment during the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yes.
You know, it's connected to that. And as you noted, it is also this violence, this attack is a response to Black achievement and Black progress. And you have to get that. I think also when you show that level of Black achievement in that moment, we can also see how history doesn't move in a linear fashion.
Right.
That not at all. And I think that's also something we see in the book, that no, the 60s and the 70s matter, but they matter in ways you may not expect that they matter.
Yeah. And for this place, they're a time of decline.
Right.
From that Black achievement. I mean, when the Johnsons different Johnsons and Versi Johnson moved to Prentice and start the college there, that starts out as a school that educates everyone from toddlers to grandparents, you know, in 1907, and then develops all these programs over the years. They're two of the only college educated people in the county. I mean, there's a handful of white people with a college education, but they are, you know, they are in the elite, right? People don't have college educations in this place. And I feel like you're right. Like with the story of Charlottesville, knowing what the story of Charlottesville and of UVA and Black students flourishing there for a while, despite not minimizing problems, but despite problems, and then the impact that something like that has.
A sort of big question. I mean, maybe not a big question, but what are your dreams for this book?
For people to, I guess, understand that history, as I said, is always somebody's story. And just because perhaps you had the football coach for your high school history teacher and it was really boring, that maybe you actually missed out on something, that history is the story of who we are. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it's always somebody's family. It's personal. It's not abstract. So that was one real goal. And the other is that kind of complexity that we've been talking about this whole time, that you can have this regime of racial violence and also Jim Crow segregation and discrimination, and some people can find a way to make a life in that, and that is a story that we need to know, that it's not just a story of oppression or success, that both of those things can happen. And that's not just a particular lesson about rural Mississippi in this time period, but it's also a lesson about our whole history, But right now, there's places that are really, really flourishing and places that are doing really, really poorly. And all of those things are true, right? And it's complicated and it's contradictory, just as human beings are. That's what makes us interesting. So I guess my hope for this book is that we could just learn to be a little bit more real about the past, not romanticize it, not make it into kind of patriotic myth, not sort of distort it for political purposes, whatever those might be, but really look at it in all of its ragged, messy, fascinating wonder. That's real, that's true.
Is there anything else this has just been a great conversation. Is there anything else that you want to add? Or?
Well, I guess one thing I would like to say is, for those of you who aren't regular readers of history, this book really is a narrative. And I did have really a truly wonderful editor who was really able to keep the story moving along. And I think it's the kind of story that would really, the book would appeal, I think, to readers of nonfiction generally, even if you're not necessarily a history buff, that it'll teach you a lot of history along the way, but that it does so in a way that doesn't feel pedantic or like you're taking your medicine. So I guess that's one thing. I guess one more thing that I would say that I haven't said yet is, I think that the story here really helps us to understand a lot about law enforcement violence in our society. We really didn't so much touch on that aspect of the book, but I talk about a conception of citizenship that I call the hands of the law. And this is an idea that white men have, that they are the hands of the law, like they personally hold the law in their hands, and whatever they do is the law. And that on the one hand fuels the kind of vigilante behavior we see across much of the South from emancipation forward, into the 1960s, and even sometimes today. Ahmaud Arbery, for example, very powerful example in the present. But that idea of the hands of the law also undergirds law enforcement violence, that as we had over time, things like the NAACP anti-lynching campaign had really turned people against vigilante violence, or created enough kind of negative publicity around it to make people change their behaviors. What we see across the South anyway, the rural South especially, is an increase in law enforcement violence. And it's important, I think, to think about how that's linked, how in our own time, people who want to be the hands of the law have an incentive to go into law enforcement. Not that everyone who's in law enforcement acts this way, but people who want to personally have that kind of power in their hands can go into law enforcement, where they can enact that power through their job. And I think we see that lately in all the reporting about what sheriffs are doing in Mississippi, that investigative journalists have been doing lately. Multiple counties in Mississippi, Black and white sheriffs, acting as the hands of the law, doing illegal things or condoning other people to engage in acts of violence. And so it's important to realize it's not just vigilante behavior, but also violence that is illegal, even if done by law enforcement, that comes out of the same conception that you personally are the law. And one of the most disturbing things to me about contemporary America is that we're not only not running from that, we're not trying to stop it. We're actually passing laws that are encouraging people to stand their ground, you don't have to retreat. You should spy on your neighbor's reproductive health choices and turn them in for a reward. We're encouraging people to take the law into their own hands rather than upholding the law as an abstract set of rules and principles that can somehow help us all to live together. We seem to be going backward. Your earlier point about history isn't a steady stream. So I did want to mention that. I think that's one of the things the book sheds light on, and I think it's a real problem in our own time.
Okay. I have one more question, and because we're running out of time, but this question it's almost a reparations question, and I'm sorry for asking such a big question. But it's this question about, that your grandfather financially benefited from this violence. And you can kind of talk through that, but also that this book is coming out. And I think the question is this question, where's the money going? And I want to complicate that a little bit, but can you talk about maybe in the telling of this story, but also the unfolding of your life, of your grandfather's life, how this notion of privilege may be operating? And have you thought about that conversation of privilege, reparations, etc.?
Absolutely. So I will just say that I have made steps on my own to support things that I think that are important in Mississippi with money that I've earned from this book. But I just feel like I want to keep that private. It's just, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So in terms of my own situation, I will say that. But I will also say that my grandfather, he obviously benefited from his position, was able to earn a living from the state. My grandmother worked for him in the sheriff's office and then worked for years in the chancellery clerk's office. So she too was in government employment and very much, also benefited. All that is true. And I think individuals, and there are movements across the country of individuals doing this, and I've tried to do some of it myself, can try to address these things. And I don't deny that we should. But the bigger problem is so much not an individual problem. I think it's so American for us to always think, what can the individual do? When this is not a problem that individuals can solve. I mean, not that we shouldn't try to do what we can personally. I'm not in any way speaking against that. This problem of reparations it can't be solved by individuals. It has to be a collective endeavor. It has to be done in a structural, larger way than that. And I think there's some really important and interesting initiatives underway, for example, to calculate how much the GI benefits that Black men were not allowed, and women, and a few women were not allowed to use during that era after the GI Bill was passed. Like, could we calculate the value of those benefits? Would that be a kind of reparations that we could do? That's just one example, collectively as a society. So I want to be careful here. Again, I'm trying to say something complicated. Individuals should do what they can, and I am personally trying to do what I can, but this cannot be solved by individuals. It has to be solved it has to be a larger structural problem. What if your family has been injured by a family that has died out, or that has nobody in that family has any resources now? Would that mean you shouldn't get some kind of reparations? I think that there's a kind of collective privilege that needs a kind of collective response, if you will.
No, that's great. And thank you for this wonderful book.
Thank you.
Also, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I think now we're going to turn it over back to Lifetime.
Thank you, Claudrena.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Hale and to Professor Harold for this compelling conversation and analysis of this important book. As we see Professor Hale's book unveils a personal story that sheds light on a time in our country's history that is important to remember and deconstruct. So thank you very much to both of you for sharing your time with us this afternoon. Thank you. So I want to take a moment and bring an upcoming Lifetime Learning program to your attention. So please consider joining Lifetime Learning and UVA's School of Architecture on Wednesday, February 21st from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. for a program entitled Community Engagement and Empathy, Designing for Change with Black Communities. In this virtual program, we'll learn about the intersection of design and community engagement and how that supports the untold stories of marginalized communities and the histories of our public spaces, especially in the American South. We'll be joined by UVA professors C.L. Bohannon and Elgin Cleckley with an introduction by the School of Architecture's Dean, Mallow Hudson. To register for this program, go to our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. When you visit our website, you can also check out other Lifetime Learning programs, the vodcast library, our Thoughts from the Law and blogs, and our UVA Speaks podcast series to read, watch, and listen to our expert UVA faculty. So thank you again for joining us for this hour in learning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.